שלא אכלנו ברכו אמוני, סבנו ואותנו כדבר אדוני.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me for the first class of my Parashat HaShavuah series. This is an idea that I had after hearing some feedback about whether to go back in person or whether to do a class over Zoom. I thought instead of engaging in the advantages and disadvantages of both, why not try something new and put together a Zoom-only class, but do it in a way that doesn't take up as much time as my usual classes used to. So usually my classes were about an hour and 15 minutes on Monday morning. I hope I don't take up that much time today. I'm hoping like 30, 45 minutes. An opportunity to delve into the Parsha of the week, to maybe frame the week ahead with a lesson or two that we can think about based on the Parsha of the week, and save this online so that people who were not able to be here on a Monday afternoon might be able to review and come back later to see what they missed. Or you could send it to a friend if you think that class was good, or not if you think the class was bad. So let me just say a word about Parashat HaShavuah, because it's something, it's a word or words that we hear a lot in Hebrew. I'm not sure that everyone appreciates the importance of Parashat HaShavuah in the cycle of Jewish life. You know that in the Torah, in Parshat Emor, there is a verse that talks about observing Shabbat. The verse says, Sheshet Yamim Ta'aseh Melacha, 6 days you shall work, Uvayom HaShevi'i Shabbat Shabbaton, the 7th day shall be the Sabbath of complete rest, Shabbat Shabbaton. Mikra Kodesh, a sacred occasion. Kol Melacha Lo Ta'asu, you shall do no work on that day. So this verse in Parshat Emor teaches us things that we know already, but adds something new. What do we know already? That there's no work to be performed that can be allowed to be performed on the 7th day. That's in the 10 Commandments, right? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So when the Torah says, Sheshet Yamim Te'aseh Melacha, work shall be done 6 days, but Uvayom HaShvi Shabbat Shabbaton, you stop doing that work on the 7th day. That's something we already know. And again, Kol Melacha Lo Ta'asu, Shabbat Hi, don't do any work on that day. This is also something we already know. What's added in this verse are 2 words, Mikra Kodesh, that are not a negative commandment, thou shalt not, but a positive commandment, thou shalt. Mikra Kodesh, make it holy, declare it to be holy. You know these words from the Kiddush that's recited on Friday night. Mikra Kodesh Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, a day that is called holy. So how do we make Shabbat holy? One of the ways that we make Shabbat holy, that we declare it to be a Mikra Kodesh, is by reading from the books that we call Kodesh. Kodesh means holy. From the holy books of our tradition, most importantly, from the 5 books of Moses, from the Sefer Torah. There's only one day a week, other than holidays, where we read an entire section, an entire parsha of the Torah, and that's Shabbat morning. The Torah is divided up into 54 different parshas. And throughout the course of a year, from Simchat Torah to Simchat Torah, we read from one end to the next, but specifically on Shabbat. It makes the day holy and causes it to frame the theme for the rest of the week. The parsha that we read on a given Shabbat is meant to animate all the days that come before. That's why it used to be very common when you were writing a letter in Hebrew, and it is still common in many circles today. Instead of calling today Tuesday, you call it Yom Sheni LeParashat, whatever the parsha is. The second day of the parsha of whatever the parsha is that week. Even the word Yom Sheni, it doesn't mean Tuesday. Tuesday's an English word. It means the second day of the week, counting from the last Shabbat. So we're counting up, all framed by the Sabbath as the sort of pillar of the week, both because of its holiness, but also because of the theme of that week's parsha, which animates the week that precedes it. Now, you know that the way the Torah reading works is we read on Shabbat morning the parsha, which was read only in brief the Saturday afternoon before, the Monday before, and the Thursday before. There's a rule in synagogue life that you're not allowed to go 3 days without hearing words of Torah. So on Saturday night, Monday morning, and Thursday morning, we get a little taste of the parsha that is to come on the coming Shabbat. And again, it's all, I think, a sign of how important the Parashat HaShavuah is in framing thematically the week that precedes it. So my intention with this class is to do exactly that and use some of the themes of the Parsha to frame our week, to think about what lessons it has. The Parshas cover stories and laws and interpersonal laws and the relationship between God and mankind, many, many different themes. And I'm just going to pick randomly on a given week what I think might be interesting to share with you all. Now, even though I said every week is defined by the parsha that is read on the upcoming Shabbat, it just happens to be that this class is starting on a week where there is no Parashat HaShavuah. That's because this coming Shabbat is Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach. It's a Shabbat where we're interrupted. The reading of the Torah, we're now in the beginning of the book of Leviticus, but it's we pause for 1 week while we commemorate Passover, and the readings are different from the Torah. And then we'll resume, not this coming Shabbat, but next Shabbat with Parshat Shmini, which is where we left off. So that's the only exception to the rule. When a holiday or Echol HaMoed appears on Shabbat, we take a break from reading the cycle of the weekly readings, and instead learn something about the holiday that's coming up. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look together at a verse that you will find 4 times in the Haggadah. So this class will help with our Pesach preparations. Won't clean your ovens, unfortunately, but it will help to frame your minds around what we ought to be thinking about. What is the theme of Passover and and themes which we should be discussing around our Seder tables. The verse that I want to talk about, as I said, you will find it 4 times in the Haggadah. Now, because it's there so frequently, you would expect that most people would know right away what verse I'm talking about. But actually, most of the time when I ask people what verse from the Torah appears more than any other verse in the Haggadah, they have no clue off the top of their heads what verse it is. Look, if it appears 4 times in the Haggadah, it's obviously an important verse. And we ought to understand it and study it and maybe think about why the Haggadah insists on us repeating this verse so many times. The verse is taken from the book of Exodus, chapter 13, verse 21. Now, if you're on your computers now and you want to open up that verse and take a look at it, you're free to do so. Sefaria is a great source that I use very often to help understand the meaning of verses according to their classical Jewish interpretations. So again, it's Exodus. I'm going to open it now on my calendar, on my Sefaria app. Exodus 13, chapter 13, verse 8. Vehigadeta levincha bayom hahu lemor. You shall explain to your child on that day, saying, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li betzeti mimitzrayim. It is because of what God did for me when I went free from Egypt. Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li betzeti mimitzrayim. Now, where will you find this in the Haggadah? I said that it's found in 4 different places. There's Daniel putting up the Sefaria link. Thank you, Daniel. Where will you find it in the Haggadah? The first place you'll find it is in the response given to the wicked son. Right? You tell the wicked son, remember, well, you're excluded yourself from the group. So if you were in Egypt all those years ago, God would not have redeemed you. It's also used as the verse that we respond with to the simple son. Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li betzeti mimitzrayim. It's then used later during in the paragraph Bechol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo keilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In every generation, one must regard himself as if he personally had gone forth from Egypt. The paragraph continues, Lemor ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li betzeti mimitzrayim, quoting the same verse. And finally, when the Haggadah asks the question, Yachol mirosh chodesh, shouldn't we start telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt on the first day of Nisan? The answer that the Haggadah gives is no, you wait until the 14th day, the first Seder. Why? Because the Torah says, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li betzeti mimitzrayim, the same verse. So let's look at those 4 instances where the verse is quoted in the Haggadah to see how this one verse, which is really just only a few words, is understood in each of the 4 places in the Haggadah in a different way. The words are picked out in a different way. The wicked son. Let's start there. Why is the response to the wicked son who says, I don't buy into any of these laws, ma avodah zot lachem, what is all this business that you are undertaking? What is it in this verse that the Haggadah finds useful in responding to the wicked child? Well, the verse says, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. Because of this, ba'avur zeh, God did for me when I went forth from Egypt. It is the personalization of this verse. That word li, God did for me, that the Haggadah finds useful in responding to the wicked son. That means if you don't see yourself as someone who inherits the legacy of the Torah, of the Jewish people, then you cannot say that God redeemed you from Egypt. So we respond to the wicked child using the language from that verse. Well, God would have saved me, but he never would have saved you because you excluded yourself from the group, from the community. Now, what in this verse is useful in responding to the simple child? The simple child asks, Mazot, what is this? It seems to me that what we find useful in this verse is how concise it is in the way it prescribes the mitzvah that you have to observe on Passover. V'higadeta lebincha bayom hahu le'mor, the verse says. Tell your child on that day, ba'avur zeh Hashem asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. That's 7 words. So to a child who asks a very simple question, we sort of use the minimum to respond to that question. We find 7 words, which it seems like the Torah allows as a response to fulfill the mitzvah of teaching your child. If you have to teach your child, all you have to say is 7 words. Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. So here you go, simple child. That's what you get from, in terms of the education tonight. So look at how already, this is, sets, I think, the framework for how we're going to look at many verses through the weeks in Parashat HaShavuah. Look already how one verse is interpreted in 2 different ways. One, to respond to a wicked child. Second, how we respond to the simple child. All because we're pulling out of this verse a meaning that's different in each case. Now, what about the third instance where the verse is quoted in the Haggadah? In every generation, one must regard himself as if he went forth from Egypt. Well, here, the emphasis is clearly on the word ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li. Because of this, God did for me when I, b'tzeiti, when I went forth from Egypt. When you tell your child, according to this verse, the story of the Exodus, you don't use the words, we're doing this because of what God did for our ancestors. Otherwise, it would have said, ba'avur zeh asa Hashem lahem. God did for them, b'tzeitam, when they went out from Egypt. But the verse says, you tell the story as if it happened to you. So there's a third way that we can delve meaning from the text. In every generation, one must clearly regard himself as if he himself had gone forth from Egypt, since the Torah uses the language b'tzeiti mimitzrayim, when I went forth from Egypt. And then finally, the fourth place this appears, remember, Yachol mirosh chodesh, asks the Haggadah. Shouldn't we start telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, about a week and a half ago? Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the month of the redemption, isn't that month the time when God first gave the commandment? The first day of the month is when God gave the commandment to Moses to take the lamb, and that there would be a plague, and we would all go forth 2 weeks later. Shouldn't we start telling the story then? This verse, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim, is used to refute the questioner and respond by affirming the appropriateness of observing this mitzvah of telling your child on the 14th day of Nisan. How do we learn that from this verse? Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. Well, the Haggadah answers that question. Ba'avur zeh. Ba'avur, because. Zeh, this. Because of this, God redeemed me from Egypt. What is this? Basha'ah, this is what the Haggadah says. B'Haggadah she Pesach matzah umaror munachim lefanav. Zeh, because of this, is an indicator, according to this interpretation, of the Passover sacrifice, the maror, and the matzah, which are displayed on the table. So we know that we don't tell the story starting on the first day of Nisan because there's no matzah or maror or Pesach sacrifice on that day. The sacrifice in the matzah and the maror happens on the 14th. And this verse, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim, seems to indicate, according to this interpretation, that the story must be told when you can actually point to those things and say Ba'avur zeh, with these things, Pesach, Matzah, or Maror, we can properly tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. 4 different times that the verse appears in the Haggadah, each time a different meaning is culled from the verse. And the verse, if I can post it up for you on using my share screen function, there you go. I've highlighted it. The verse classically has 2 rabbinic interpretations that disagree with each other. Here's the verse up top. Vehigadeta levincha bayom hahu lemor. Teach your child on that day, lemor, and say, Ba'avur zeh, because of this, asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. God did for me when I went forth from Egypt. Look at 2 interpretations. Don't worry about the Hebrew. I'm going to translate. On the right is the interpretation I highlighted from Rabbi Saadia Gaon. Rabbi Saadia Gaon is a famous medieval interpreter of the Torah. He wrote a commentary, one of the most important rabbinic figures who wrote in Judeo-Arabic, actually. And he wrote on many different subjects, wrote on the Talmud and Jewish philosophy from the 10th century. The 10th century. Saadia Gaon writes, Zeh ba'avur ma she'asa Hashem li. Zeh ba'avur. What does Rabbi Saadia Gaon do? He says, look, the verse has a bit of a mistake in it. The verse says, Ba'avur zeh, because of this, God did for me when I went forth from Egypt. But it should have said, Zeh ba'avur, the reverse. This, because of what God did for me when I went forth from Egypt. What do you think he's talking about when he says, this, because of what God did for me when I went forth from Egypt? I think it's clear. He means this Pesach, matzah, umaror, all this stuff on my table. Zeh ba'avur asa Hashem li b'tzeitim mitzrayim. If you flip the words around, Rabbi Sadia Gaon's interpretation makes more sense. We have all these things on the table, which we're doing because God freed me, took me out of Egypt. This is Rav Sadia Gaon's interpretation. Of course, the problem with the way he understands the verse is that's not what the verse says. It doesn't say Zeh ba'avur asa Hashem li b'tzeitim mitzrayim. It says ba'avur zeh. Not this because, but because of this. So Rashi says something else. Rashi is the interpreter of the Torah par excellence. He uses sources from rabbinic literature to bring the text to life, to fill in the blanks, and to try and call the real meaning from behind the words. Look what Rashi says. Ba'avur zeh, because of this, ba'avur she'akayem mitzvotav. God brought us out of Egypt for a reason. Ba'avur zeh, for the following reason, God took me out of Egypt. And Rashi fills in the blank. What is the reason? So that we would follow in God's commandments. This is a totally different read than the read of Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon, remember, changes the language. Zeh ba'avur, my son. All this, the whole Seder, is because God took us out of Egypt. Rashi says, no. It has nothing to do with what's on the table. Your commandment on Passover night is not just to explain what happened to our ancestors and to you, because we have to regard ourselves as if we went forth from Egypt. But why? Not just what happened, but why. You must be able to answer the question, Ba'avur zeh. What is the zeh? For Rashi, it's to follow in the commandments. Ba'avur she'akayem mitzvotav. God took us out of Egypt so that we could follow the commandments. But really, it could be anything. The important principle of the commandment is be able to tell your child why God redeemed you from Egypt. This is a really important verse. I'll say it again. It appears more than any other verse in the Torah, in the Haggadah. Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeitim mitzrayim. And yet I don't know at how many Seders we really think about what this verse might mean and how it obligates us and what it obligates us with at the Seder. It is not enough, according to Rashi, to sit around the table and to tell the story of history. This is what happened. There is a philosophical question that must be posed. Why did God liberate our ancestors? What was the point of this whole thing? The Torah has answers, right? God says, I took you out of Egypt so that I could take you to be my people, so that I could give you the Torah, so that I could bring you to the promised land to live out my divine commandments. I understand that the Torah has an answer to the question, but around your tables, the answers might be different. Around your tables, maybe there is a kind of freedom that speaks to the people around the table that's particularly relevant to today. Freedom so that you could be free is not an acceptable answer. God took you out of Egypt so you could be free. I don't think anybody really believes that God took us out of Egypt just so that we could do whatever we want to do. That's not the story the Torah tells. God took us out of Egypt for a mission, for a purpose. And I would submit to you that it is the mentioning, it is the exploration of that specific purpose, which might be the very mitzvah that you have to perform for your children around the table. Not to explain why we have a shank bone and why we have a matzah and why we have a maror. V'higadeta levincha bayomahu, you shall tell your child on that day, ba'avur zeh. This is why God took me out of Egypt and liberated me. Answer the question, why? And I hope that around the tables this week, you now have an interesting question to ask to everybody. And more importantly, that you know where the question comes from. It comes from not Parashat HaShavuah, but it comes from the Torah that tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And not only that, but commands us to remember it eternally from year to year, with remembrances, with rituals, with symbols, and with discussion. So I wish everybody a happy Passover. We did this in exactly 30 minutes, exactly what I wanted. So thank you for your attention, and Chag Kasher V'Sameach. If you have any comments, by the way, you can always feel free to write me. jrgrover@gmail.com is the easiest email address to remember. jrgrover@gmail.com. Thank you very much.